The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Coyote Ridge, a small town nestled between jagged rock formations and endless stretches of dried grassland. It was the kind of place where the wind carried more sand than hope, where the horizon shimmered with heat mirages that promised water but delivered only more scorched earth. The year was 1873, and the West was still wild enough to break a person's spirit before breakfast. Sarah Mae Collins pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way down the wooden sidewalk, her worn boots clicking against the planks with a rhythm that spoke of exhaustion. 26 years old and already bearing the weight of widowhood. She kept her eyes downcast, avoiding the stares of the townspeople who whispered behind gloved hands and shop windows. Her son, little Tommy, barely 5 years old, clutched her hand with the fierce grip of a child who'd learned too early that the world could snatch away what you loved most. "Mama, why do they look at us like that?" Tommy asked, his voice small against the vastness of the dusty street. Sarah's heart clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Pay them no mind, sweet boy. We've got washing to deliver to Mrs. Henderson, and she promised us fresh bread if we're quick about it." The truth was harder to swallow than the dust that coated everything in Coyote Ridge. Ever since her husband Daniel had died in that mine collapse 2 years back, a collapse some whispered wasn't entirely accidental. The good people of the town had found it convenient to blame the young widow for everything from failed crops to sick cattle. It started with small things: missed invitations to church socials, crossed streets when she approached, prices that somehow doubled when she entered the general store. But lately, the whispers had grown louder, darker. At the center of it all sat Judge Cornelius Blackwood, a man whose considerable girth matched only his appetite for control. From his office above the bank, he ruled Coyote Ridge with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of moral righteousness. He owned half the businesses in town, held mortgages on most of the rest, and had the sheriff so deep in his pocket that the man might as well have been loose change. The judge, as everyone called him, had taken a particular interest in the young widow Collins ever since she'd refused his generous offer to buy her late husband's small plot of land for 1/10 of its value. As Sarah hurried past the saloon, she noticed a stranger lounging against the hitching post, his hat pulled low against the sun. He was tall and lean, with the kind of stillness that spoke of a man comfortable with long silences and vast distances. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, his gun belt worn with the ease of long practice. Unlike the townspeople, he didn't stare at her with judgment or false pity. He simply watched, those gray eyes taking in everything and giving nothing back. Jake Morrison had ridden into Coyote Ridge just that morning, looking for nothing more than a meal, a bed, and fodder for his horse. He'd been drifting since the war ended, unable to settle anywhere for long, carrying ghosts that whispered to him in the dark. The town looked like a dozen others he'd passed through, sun-baked, mean, and full of people with too much time for other folks' business. But something about the woman hurrying past caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she held her head high despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Or maybe it was the fierce protectiveness in how she positioned herself between her boy and the watching eyes of the town. The trouble started, as troubles often do in small towns, with something insignificant. Mrs. Abernathy, the mayor's wife and self-appointed moral guardian of Coyote Ridge, claimed she'd seen Sarah near her hen house the morning her prize rooster went missing. Never mind that Sarah had been doing washing at the creek with 3 other women who could vouch for her. Never mind that the Abernathy's dog had been seen with feathers in his mouth. The accusation was made, and in a town primed for cruelty, and that was enough. By afternoon, Sheriff Watson had appeared at Sarah's small cabin on the edge of town. He was a thin man who seemed to shrink inside his badge, his authority borrowed from Judge Blackwood like an ill-fitting coat. "I'm sorry, Sarah Mae," he said, not meeting her eyes. "But I've got to bring you in. Judge's orders." "On what charge?" Sarah demanded, pulling Tommy behind her skirts. "Theft, destruction of property, and—" Watson swallowed hard. "Moral turpitude." The last charge was the judge's special touch, vague enough to mean anything, damning enough to justify whatever punishment he saw fit to devise. Sarah knew then that this wasn't about a rooster. This was about her land, her refusal to bow and scrape, her stubborn insistence on surviving when the town wanted her broken. As Watson led her away, Tommy crying and reaching for her, Sarah caught sight of the stranger again. He'd moved from the saloon to the general store porch, those gray eyes tracking their procession. For a moment, their gazes met, and she saw something flicker across his weathered features. Not pity, she'd had enough of that to last a lifetime, but something else. Recognition, perhaps, the look of someone who knew what it was like to face the world with the deck stacked against you. Jake watched them disappear into the courthouse, the boys' cries fading into the general noise of the town. He'd seen this play before in other towns, other times. The powerful feeding on the powerless. Justice twisted into a cudgel to beat down anyone who didn't fit. He took a slow sip from his canteen, decision crystallizing like salt in the desert heat. He'd planned to leave at first light, but something told him Coyote Ridge wasn't done with him yet. Inside the courthouse, a crowd was already gathering. Word traveled fast in a town starved for entertainment. And a public trial, especially one where Judge Blackwood could grandstand about morality and proper behavior, was better than a traveling show. They packed the benches, fanning themselves with whatever came to hand, eager eyes fixed on the small woman standing alone before the judge's massive oak bench. Judge Blackwood sat like a toad on his throne, black robe straining across his bulk, gavel clutched in one meaty fist. His eyes, small and mean in the folds of his face, glittered with satisfaction. Here, finally, was his chance to make an example of the Collins woman, to show the town what happened to those who defied him. "Sarah May Collins," he intoned, his voice rolling across the courtroom like thunder. "You stand accused of theft, destruction of property, and conduct unbecoming a Christian woman. How do you plead?" Sarah lifted her chin, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I've done nothing wrong." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Blackwood's face darkened. He'd expected her to grovel, to beg for mercy. Her defiance was like salt in an open wound. "The evidence says otherwise," he growled. "Multiple witnesses place you near the scene of the crime." "What witnesses?" Sarah demanded. "I was at the creek with Martha Palmer, Betty Sullivan, and Jane Morrison. They'll tell you—" "Silence!" The gavel came down hard enough to make everyone jump. "Those women are known associates of yours. Their testimony is worthless." "I have it on good authority from upstanding citizens that you were seen acting suspiciously near the Abernathy property." Sarah knew then that this was a foregone conclusion. The judge had made up his mind before she'd ever entered the courtroom. This was theater. Nothing more. A show to remind everyone who held the power in Coyote Ridge. Outside, Jake Morrison stood in the shadows of the courthouse, listening to the proceedings through an open window. He'd heard his sister Jane's name mentioned and felt a flicker of surprise. He hadn't known she'd settled in this godforsaken place. But then, they'd lost touch after the war, each dealing with their ghosts in their own way. The thought of her vouching for this woman, standing up against the obvious corruption of the court, stirred something in him he'd thought long dead. The afternoon wore on, the heat building inside the courtroom until it felt like the inside of an oven. False witness after false witness took the stand, each adding their own embellishments to the story. Sarah had been stealing for months. She'd been seen in compromising situations. She was a bad influence on the good women of the town. With each lie, Judge Blackwood nodded sagely, as if hearing confirmation of what he'd always known. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of blood and dust, Judge Blackwood raised his gavel for the final time. "Sarah May Collins, this court finds you guilty on all charges. As a warning to others who might follow your path of wickedness, I sentence you to 20 lashes, to be administered publicly in the town square at dawn tomorrow." The crowd gasped. Public flogging had fallen out of favor in most civilized places. But Coyote Ridge was far from civilization, and Judge Blackwood's word was law. Sarah swayed on her feet but didn't fall. She thought of Tommy, of the little plot of land that was all she had left of Daniel, of the dignity she'd fought so hard to maintain. All of it would be stripped away tomorrow, along with the skin from her back. As the crowd filed out, eager to spread the news, Jake Morrison remained in the shadows. He'd stayed out of other people's troubles for years now, minded his own business, kept his head down and his gun holstered unless directly challenged. But something about this situation, the casual cruelty of it, the obvious corruption, the courage of that small woman facing down a rigged system, had lit a fire in his gut he'd thought extinguished. He thought of his sister Jane, somewhere in this town, brave enough to stand as a witness for what was right even when it couldn't make a difference. He thought of all the times he'd walked away from injustice, telling himself it wasn't his fight. Tomorrow, they would tie an innocent woman to a post and flog her for the entertainment of the crowd and the satisfaction of a corrupt judge. Jake pushed away from the wall. Decision made. He'd been drifting long enough. Tomorrow, Coyote Ridge would learn that sometimes. A quiet cowboy could speak louder than all their false righteousness combined. As night fell over the town, Sarah sat in her cell, listening to Tommy's distant cries from wherever they'd taken him. The stranger's gray eyes haunted her thoughts, that moment of connection in a world that had shown her precious little kindness. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he'd looked at her with such recognition, but for the first time in 2 years, she'd felt seen as something more than the tragic widow Collins. Tomorrow would bring pain and humiliation. But tonight, in the darkness of her cell, Sarah Mae Collins held onto that momentary connection with a nameless cowboy and found, to her surprise, that she still had hope to spare. Dawn came to Coyote Ridge like a reluctant witness, painting the sky in shades of rust and ash. The town square, usually empty at this hour save for a few early-rising shopkeepers, was already filling with spectators. Word of the public punishment had spread like wildfire, and folks had come from neighboring homesteads to witness Judge Blackwood's justice. The whipping post stood in the center of the square like an accusation, its wood worn smooth by wind and previous use. Someone had already swept the ground around it clean, as if preparing a stage for the morning's grim theater. Women clutched their shawls despite the growing heat, while men passed flasks between them, building courage or numbing conscience. In the courthouse jail, Sarah Mae Collins sat on the edge of her narrow cot, hands folded in her lap to stop their trembling. She'd spent the night in prayer and memory, thinking of Daniel's laugh, of Tommy's first steps, of all the small moments that made a life worth living. Sheriff Watson appeared at her cell door, keys jangling like 30 pieces of silver. "Time to go, Sarah Mae," he said, unable to meet her eyes. She stood slowly, dignified despite her circumstances. "Where's my boy?" "Mrs. Morrison's got him. Your friend's sister. She came for him last night." A small mercy in an ocean of cruelty. Sarah nodded, grateful that Tommy wouldn't witness what was to come. She let Watson lead her out, head high, refusing to give the gathering crowd the satisfaction of seeing her broken before the first lash fell. Judge Blackwood was already in position on a raised platform beside the post, resplendent in his black robes despite the early hour. His face gleamed with sweat and satisfaction as he surveyed his domain. This would teach them all, he thought. After today, no one would dare question his authority again. "Citizens of Coyote Ridge," he boomed, his voice carrying across the square, "we gather this morning to witness justice. Let this serve as a lesson to all who would break our laws and disturb our moral order." The crowd murmured its approval, though not all faces showed enthusiasm. Martha Palmer and Betty Sullivan stood together near the back, faces drawn with worry. Jane Morrison was notably absent, keeping Tommy far from the square as promised. But most had come for the spectacle, the break from routine, the chance to feel righteous in their observance of another's punishment. Sarah was led to the post, her hands bound to the iron ring above her head. The position forced her to face the crowd, to see every eager face, every averted eye. She searched for kindness and found little, until her gaze landed on a familiar figure. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, his gray eyes fixed on her. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but his presence was like a cool drink of water in the desert. He was wearing the same travel-worn clothes, the same low-pulled hat, but something in his stance had changed. There was purpose there now, coiled like a spring. The executioner stepped forward. Big Tom Muller, the blacksmith, pressed into service for his strong arm. He held the whip loosely, testing its weight. 9 feet of braided leather designed to tear flesh and break spirit. He'd been promised a reduction in his tax debt for this morning's work. 20 lashes, Judge Blackwood announced, savoring each word. For theft, destruction of property, and moral turpitude. Let the punishment commence. Big Tom drew back his arm, the whip uncoiling like a snake. The crowd held its breath. Sarah closed her eyes, bracing for the first blow. It never came. Instead, there was movement in the crowd, a figure pushing through the packed bodies with quiet determination. Jake Morrison stepped into the cleared circle around the whipping post, positioning himself directly between Sarah and Big Tom's raised whip. The judge ordered her whipped in public. Someone in the crowd muttered, until a quiet cowboy stepped in front of her back. The silence that followed was complete. Even the morning birds seemed to hold their songs. Jake stood with his back to Sarah, facing Big Tom and the crowd, his hand resting casual-like on his gun belt. He didn't draw, didn't need to. The threat was in his stillness, in the way he occupied space like he had every right to it. "Step aside, stranger," Judge Blackwood commanded, his face flushing purple. "This is lawful punishment, decreed by this court." Jake didn't move. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried to every corner of the square. "Don't reckon I will." "You dare defy the law?" Blackwood sputtered. "I defy injustice," Jake replied. "Seen enough of it to know it when it stands in front of me, wearing black robes and calling itself righteousness." Big Tom stood frozen, whip still raised but uncertain. He was used to horseshoes and plowshares, not confrontation with armed men. The crowd began to stir, whispers running through them like wind through wheat. Sarah stared at the broad back shielding her, scarcely daring to breathe. She could see the tension in Jake's shoulders, the readiness in his stance. He was one man against a town, yet he stood as if he had an army behind him. "Sheriff Watson," Judge Blackwood roared, "arrest this man for obstruction of justice." Watson stepped forward reluctantly, hand hovering near his pistol. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside." Jake turned his head slightly, just enough for Watson to see his eyes. "Son, you seem like a decent sort who's gotten himself turned around. Ask yourself if this is the hill you want to die on." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Watson had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who'd been pushed past caring about consequences. He stopped mid-step, swallowing hard. "He's just one man," Blackwood screamed. "Take him!" But the crowd had gone strange. Some were angry at the interruption of their entertainment, but others, those who'd kept silent about their doubts, who'd whispered their disagreements only in private, began to find their voices. "Maybe the stranger's got a point," someone called out. 20 lashes for a stolen rooster seems harsh," added another. "If she even stole it." Martha Palmer said loudly, "Which she didn't, as some of us tried to tell you yesterday." Jake hadn't moved from his position, but Sarah could feel something shifting in the air. The absolute power Judge Blackwood wielded depended on fear and compliance. One man's defiance had created a crack in that foundation. "You'll hang for this," Blackwood hissed at Jake. "I'll see you swing before sunset." "Maybe," Jake allowed, "but not before you explain to these good folks why you're so eager to whip a woman who refused to sell you her land. Not before you tell them about the offers you made, the threats when she said no." Sarah's eyes widened. How did he know about that? She'd told no one about the judge's visits, his increasingly aggressive attempts to force her off her property. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Land disputes were serious business in the West, and suddenly the persecution of the widow Collins took on a different cast. "Lies," Blackwood shouted. This man is clearly in league with this woman, probably her lover, here to— I never saw him before yesterday, Sarah said, finding her voice. But what he says is true. Judge Blackwood has been trying to force me off my land since my husband died. When I wouldn't sell, he said he'd find another way. Shut your mouth, woman. Blackwood was losing control, his carefully constructed image of moral authority cracking. Big Tom, proceed with the punishment. Strike them both if necessary. Big Tom looked at the whip in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. He was a simple man who shaped iron for a living, not someone who hurt women for the entertainment of crowds. The tax debt that had seemed so important yesterday now felt like a lead weight in his stomach. I don't think I can do this, Judge, he said slowly, lowering the whip. Then you'll join them in punishment, Blackwood screamed. Sheriff, I want arrests. I want order. But Sheriff Watson seemed to have found something fascinating to study on the ground near his boots. Deputy Collins, no relation to Sarah, had developed a sudden deafness. The crowd, smelling blood in the water, began to press closer. Jake still hadn't moved, still stood between Sarah and any threat. Seems to me, he said conversationally, that a judge who uses his position to steal land and punish those who refuse him isn't much of a judge at all. How dare you? I dare because I've seen your type before. Jake continued. Petty tyrants who mistake fear for respect, who think the law is something they own instead of serve. Met plenty during the war, wearing blue and gray both. They all end the same way, alone and afraid when their power crumbles. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, but they weren't from fear or pain. Someone had stood up for her. This stranger, this quiet cowboy, had placed himself between her and injustice without being asked, without expecting anything in return. Judge Blackwood looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed kingdom beginning to crumble. The crowd that had come for blood was turning, their murmurs growing hostile, but not toward the woman tied to the post. This isn't over, he snarled. You'll both rot in jail for this. I'll see you both punished. The law, Jake interrupted, is supposed to protect folks, not persecute them for keeping what's rightfully theirs. He finally turned slightly, addressing the crowd. How many of you have felt the judge's boot on your neck? How many have paid taxes that lined his pockets, faced his justice that always seemed to benefit him? The response was immediate. Voices raised in agreement, old grievances suddenly finding air. The merchant forced to sell cheap, the farmer whose loan came due early, the widow whose husband's death was ruled accidental despite evidence otherwise. Sarah watched in amazement as the crowd's mood shifted like a tide turning. Jake Morrison had done more than step in front of a whip. He'd held up a mirror to the town's conscience. Release her, someone shouted. Let the woman go. Others took up the cry. Judge Blackwood backed toward the courthouse, suddenly aware that he stood on a platform surrounded by people he'd wronged. His deputies had melted away. Sheriff Watson was already working at Sarah's bonds, muttering apologies. This is sedition, Blackwood shouted. Rebellion. I'll have federal marshals here. I'll see you all punished. I reckon you'll be too busy explaining yourself to them, Jake said mildly. Might want to check your books before they arrive. I hear federal judges take a dim view of embezzlement and judicial misconduct. As Sarah's hands came free, she rubbed her wrists, still processing the sudden reversal. The sun was fully up now, beating down on a very different scene than anyone had expected. The whipping post stood empty, its intended victim free, while the would-be executioner had dropped his whip and disappeared into the crowd. Judge Blackwood made one last attempt at authority. Mark my words. You'll all regret this. I own this town. I own all of you. Not anymore, Jake said quietly, but his words carried, not anymore. With a final snarl of rage, Judge Blackwood fled toward the courthouse, robes billowing behind him like the wings of a diseased crow. The crowd parted to let him pass, their silence more damning than any shouted accusation. Sarah stood on shaking legs, looking up at the man who'd saved her. Why, she whispered. You don't know me. You could have been killed. Jake finally turned to face her fully, and she saw something in those gray eyes that made her heart skip. "Sometimes a man has to decide what he stands for," he said. "I've been running from that decision for too long." Around them, the crowd began to disperse, but the energy remained electric. Something fundamental had shifted in Coyote Ridge. The absolute power of Judge Blackwood had been broken by one man's quiet courage and a town's rediscovered conscience. "We should go," Jake said, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. "The judge won't take this quietly. He'll try to regroup, call in favors." "I need to get Tommy," Sarah said, still feeling dazed. "Your sister has him." "Jane." Jake's face softened slightly. "Should have known she'd be mixed up in doing the right thing. Runs in the family, though I've been fighting it for years." As they walked away from the square, Sarah noticed how the townspeople looked at them now, not with scorn or pity, but with something approaching respect. Martha Palmer reached out to squeeze her hand. Big Tom Muller tipped his hat in apology. Small gestures, but they meant the world. Behind them, the whipping post stood empty in the morning sun. A monument to power challenged and cruelty denied. The day that had begun with the promise of pain had become something else entirely. The first day of Coyote Ridge's liberation from the tyranny of Judge Cornelius Blackwood. But as Jake had warned, such men didn't accept defeat easily. Even now, Blackwood was likely plotting his revenge, and he had resources beyond the town's borders. The victory in the square was just the beginning. Sarah glanced at the man walking beside her, this unlikely protector who'd appeared when she needed him most. "I don't even know your full name," she said. "Jake Morrison," he replied. "And you're Sarah Mae Collins, widow, mother, and apparently the bravest woman in Coyote Ridge for standing up to that bloated toad for so long." Despite everything, Sarah found herself almost smiling. Brave or foolish, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. "In my experience," Jake said, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. "They're often the same thing. The difference is in what you're fighting for." As they approached the edge of town where Jane Morrison lived, Sarah felt a shift in the air. The morning's dramatic reversal had created a moment of possibility, but moments passed quickly in the harsh reality of the frontier. Soon, very soon, Judge Blackwood would strike back. But for now, she was free, her son was safe, and she walked beside a man who'd risked everything for justice. It was more than she'd dared hope for when she'd awakened in that jail cell. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day in Coyote Ridge. But something had changed in the town's character, something that couldn't be undone by threats or violence. A quiet cowboy had stood against injustice, and in doing so, had reminded an entire community what courage looked like. The Morrison homestead sat on the eastern edge of town, a modest but well-kept house with a vegetable garden fighting valiantly against the desert climate. Jane Morrison stood on the porch, Tommy Collins in her arms, her face a mixture of relief and worry as she watched her brother approach with Sarah. "Jake," she breathed, setting Tommy down so he could run to his mother. "When I heard what you did, Lord Almighty, you never could do things the easy way." "Mama!" Tommy flew into Sarah's arms, burying his face against her shoulder. "Mrs. Jane said you were coming back. She said a hero was protecting you." Sarah held her son tight, tears flowing freely now, over his head. She watched Jake embrace his sister, the reunion clearly unexpected for both siblings. 2 years. "Jake," Jane said softly. 2 years without a word, and you show up like this." "I know," Jake replied, his usual stoicism cracking slightly. "I'm sorry. Jane, after the war, after what happened, I couldn't stay still." The afternoon sun blazed overhead, but they all crowded into Jane's small parlor, aware that time was precious. Judge Blackwood wouldn't lick his wounds for long. "He'll come for you both," Jane said, pouring water from a pitcher with hands that shook slightly. "He's got connections all the way to the territorial capital, federal marshals in his pocket, hired guns on call. Then we need to move fast." Jake said, "Sarah, is there anywhere you can go? Family back east?" Sarah shook her head. Daniel's family blamed me for his death. My own people. They're gone. This is all I have. She paused, then added firmly, "Besides, I won't run. That land is Tommy's inheritance. It's all I have left of his father." "Brave words," Jake said. "But Blackwood won't stop now. His authority depends on fear. What happened this morning broke that fear, and he'll do anything to get it back." A commotion outside made them all freeze. Jake moved to the window, hand on his pistol, but relaxed slightly. "It's some of the townspeople. Looks like Martha Palmer and a few others." Jane opened the door to find a small delegation on her porch. Martha Palmer, Betty Sullivan, Big Tom Muller looking sheepish, and, surprisingly, Sheriff Watson without his badge. "We need to talk," Martha said without preamble, "about what comes next." They crowded into the small house, the atmosphere charged with a nervous energy. Sheriff Watson spoke first, hat in his hands. "I resigned," he said simply. "Turned in my badge and told Blackwood I was done being his puppet. Should have done it years ago." He looked at Sarah. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins, for everything. What's done is done," Sarah said quietly. "What matters is what we do now. That's why we're here." Big Tom rumbled. "The judge has locked himself in the courthouse with a few of his hardcore supporters. Word is he's sent riders to Fort Laramie and telegraphed the territorial governor. He's calling what happened this morning an armed insurrection." "Which means," Martha Palmer added grimly, "federal troops could be here within the week, maybe sooner." Jake leaned against the wall, processing this information. "He's overplaying his hand. Federal investigators will find his corruption if they dig deep enough. If they bother to dig," Betty Sullivan countered. "Or they might just see a town in rebellion and act accordingly." "There's more," Watson said. "Blackwood's put a bounty on both of you, $500 each, dead or alive. Every gunslinger and bounty hunter within 100 miles will be riding this way." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. $500 was more money than most men saw in a year. It would bring every desperate and dangerous man in the territory to their door. "We need to organize," Jake said calmly. "Form a town council. Establish legitimate authority before the Federals arrive. Show them we're not in rebellion, just cleaning out corruption." "With what authority?" Watson asked. "I was the law here, such as it was, without the judge. The people are the authority," Jake said. "That's what this country was built on, wasn't it? Government by consent of the governed. Well, I'd say the governed withdrew their consent this morning." Tommy had been sitting quietly in his mother's lap, but now he tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, are the bad men coming?" Sarah smoothed his hair, heart aching. "Don't you worry, sweet boy, mister. Jake and these good people won't let anything happen to us." But even as she comforted her son, she could see the doubt in everyone's eyes. They were shopkeepers and farmers, not fighters, against professional gunmen and possibly federal troops. What chance did they have? "I have an idea," Jane said suddenly. "The old Spanish mission, up in the canyon. It's defensible, has water, and most importantly, it's on church land. Even Blackwood would think twice about spilling blood there." Jake nodded slowly. "Could work as a temporary refuge. But we can't hide forever." "Not hiding," Jane countered. "Regrouping, giving us time to get word to honest authorities, build our case against Blackwood." As they debated, a new voice from the doorway made them all turn. "Perhaps I can help with that." A man stood there in a dusty black suit, thin and scholarly looking, with steel-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet authority. He held a leather satchel and looked entirely out of place in the frontier setting. "Who are you?" Jake demanded, hand drifting to his gun. "My name is Josiah Henderson," the man said calmly. "I'm a federal prosecutor from Denver. I've been investigating Judge Blackwood for 6 months, gathering evidence of his corruption. This morning's events have provided me with the final pieces I need." The room erupted in questions, but Henderson held up a hand. "Please, we don't have much time. Judge Blackwood doesn't know I'm here. I've been posing as a traveling book salesman." "But I need witnesses, documents, Anything that can prove his crimes in a federal court. Sarah found her voice first. I have letters, threats he made, offers to buy my land for nothing. I kept them all. Excellent, Henderson said. And I'll need statements from everyone about his abuses of power. But first, we need to ensure your safety. The bounty he's posted is illegal, but that won't stop desperate men from trying to collect. As if his words had summoned them. The sound of horses approaching fast made everyone freeze. Jake moved to the window again, his face hardening. 3 riders coming hard, armed. He looked at Sarah and Tommy. Jane, get them to the root cellar, now! But Sarah stood, setting Tommy in Jane's arms. No, I'm done hiding. I'm done letting fear rule my life. Sarah, Jake began, but she cut him off. You stood for me this morning. Let me stand for myself now. The riders pulled up outside, dust swirling around them. Through the window, they could see 3 hard-looking men, trail-worn and dangerous. One of them, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, called out, We know you're in there. Morrison, you and the woman come out peaceable-like, and nobody else gets hurt. We're just here for the bounty. Jake checked his pistol, mind calculating odds. 3 men, possibly more nearby. A house full of civilians. Not good. What bounty would that be? Henderson called out, surprising everyone. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I haven't authorized any bounties in this territory. There was a pause. The scarred man spoke again, less certain now. Judge Blackwood posted it, 500 each for the woman and the man who interfered with justice. Judge Blackwood is under federal investigation, Henderson announced. Any bounty he's posted is fraudulent. Moreover, anyone attempting to collect it will be charged with attempted murder of federal witnesses. The 3 men conferred among themselves. The promise of easy money was one thing. Tangling with federal law was another. After a tense moment, they wheeled their horses around and rode off, though Jake noticed they didn't go far, just to the saloon where they could watch the house. That won't stop them all. Jake said quietly. No, Henderson agreed. But it might buy us time. Now, I need those documents and statements. We have perhaps 2 days before Blackwood's message reaches Fort Laramie. If I can telegraph my superiors first, provide evidence of his crimes. They worked through the afternoon. Henderson taking careful notes as each person told their story of Judge Blackwood's tyranny. Sarah retrieved the threatening letters from their hiding place, each one more damning than the last. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd turned the law into a weapon for personal gain. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake found Sarah standing on the porch, watching the horizon. You were brave today, he said quietly. Braver than you needed to be. You taught me something this morning, she replied. Sometimes standing up is the only choice that lets you keep your soul. She paused, then added, But I'm scared. Jake, for Tommy, for all of us. What if Henderson can't stop what's coming? Jake stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Then we face it together. I've been running from responsibility for too long. Maybe it's time I stopped. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the danger, the fear, the uncertainty all faded away. There was something between them, something that had sparked the moment he'd stepped in front of that whip. Mama? Tommy's voice broke the spell. He stood in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. Are you coming inside? Yes, sweet boy, Sarah said, but her eyes remained on Jake a moment longer. We're coming. As they went inside, neither saw the lone rider on the ridge above town, watching the house through a spyglass. One of Blackwood's men sent to observe and report. The judge hadn't given up. He was planning his counterstrike. Inside, Henderson was finishing his notes. I have enough, he announced. I'll ride to the telegraph office at Cedar Creek tonight. With luck, I'll have federal marshals, honest ones, here within 3 days. And if Blackwood's men try to stop you? Jane asked. Henderson smiled thinly. I didn't survive 6 months undercover by being careless. I have my own protection arranged." As night fell over Coyote Ridge, the small group in Jane Morrison's house represented something new, the birth of resistance against tyranny. They were ordinary people pushed to extraordinary courage, led by a quiet cowboy who'd remembered what it meant to stand for something. But the night also held danger. Judge Blackwood sat in his courthouse fortress, rage building like a thunderstorm. The bounty hunters gathered in the saloon, greed temporarily checked by fear of federal law, but not extinguished. And somewhere in the darkness between the town and Fort Laramie, riders carried messages that could bring either salvation or destruction. Sarah tucked Tommy into bed in Jane's small spare room, the boy clutching a wooden horse Jake had carved for him that afternoon. As she kissed his forehead, she whispered a prayer for protection, for courage, for the strength to see this through. Outside his door, she found Jake standing guard, his presence reassuring in the darkness. "You should rest," he said softly. "Tomorrow will be difficult." "Will you be here?" she asked, hating how vulnerable the question made her sound. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake promised. "Not this time." As Sarah settled beside her son, listening to his peaceful breathing, she held on to those words like a talisman against the dark. Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of trials to come. But for the first time in 2 years, she didn't face them alone. The quiet cowboy stood watch through the night, gray eyes scanning the darkness, protecting what he'd come to realize was worth fighting for. The morning had shown him something he'd lost in the war's aftermath, that standing against injustice, whatever the cost, was what made a man whole. And in the courthouse across town, Judge Blackwood plotted revenge, unaware that his empire of fear had already begun to crumble, brought down by the simple act of one man stepping in front of a whip meant for an innocent woman's back. The morning after Henderson's departure dawned blood red, an ominous sign that matched the tension gripping Coyote Ridge. Jake stood on Jane's porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the town stir to life. The 3 bounty hunters from yesterday had been joined by 2 more during the night, and he could see them lounging outside the saloon, patient as vultures. "They're waiting for something," Sarah said softly, joining him on the porch. She'd slept little, evident in the shadows under her eyes, but her chin was set with determination. "Blackwood's next move," Jake agreed. "He's too smart to act without a plan. Question is, what's he cooking up in that courthouse?" Their answer came sooner than expected. Around mid-morning, Deputy Collins, who'd stayed loyal to Blackwood, rode through town with a proclamation. By noon, a crowd had gathered in the square to hear it read. Judge Blackwood himself appeared on the courthouse steps, flanked by a dozen armed men Jake didn't recognize. Hired guns, brought in during the night. The judge had abandoned any pretense of judicial dignity. He wore a gun belt over his robes, his face mottled with rage and sleeplessness. "Citizens of Coyote Ridge," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "Yesterday, this town witnessed an act of rebellion against lawful authority. A dangerous criminal interfered with justice, aided by conspirators who have long plotted against the peace and prosperity of our community." Jake and Sarah watched from the edge of the crowd, having left Tommy in Jane's care. Jake's hand rested on his pistol, noting the positions of Blackwood's gunmen. "Therefore," Blackwood continued, "I am declaring martial law in Coyote Ridge until federal authorities arrive to restore order. A curfew is in effect from sunset to sunrise. Anyone on the streets after dark will be shot. Anyone harboring the fugitives Jake Morrison and Sarah Collins will be arrested for treason." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear, anger, uncertainty, mixing in equal measure. "Furthermore," Blackwood's voice rose to a crescendo, "I am appointing a new sheriff to enforce these measures. Mr. Wade Garrison will maintain order with whatever force necessary." A man stepped forward from among the hired guns, tall, lean, with dead eyes and matched Colts on his hips. Wade Garrison had a reputation that stretched from Texas to Montana. None of it good. He was a killer who wore a badge when it suited him. removed it when it didn't. "This is our answer to federal investigation?" Someone in the crowd called out. "Hired killers." Garrison's hand moved to his gun with liquid speed, drawing and firing into the air so fast most people didn't see him move. The crowd flinched back. "Anyone else got opinions they'd like to share?" Garrison asked, his voice soft and dangerous. "I'm here to keep the peace. How peaceful things stay is up to you folks." Jake felt Sarah tense beside him. This was worse than they'd anticipated. Blackwood wasn't just fighting back, he was doubling down, betting that he could maintain control through pure force until he could spin the story his way to federal authorities. "We need to go," Jake murmured. "Now." They slipped away from the crowd, but not unnoticed. One of Garrison's men nudged him, pointing. The gunman's cold eyes tracked them, a slight smile playing at his lips. He didn't pursue, not yet. He was the kind of predator who enjoyed the hunt as much as the kill. Back at Jane's house, they found the others in heated discussion. Former Sheriff Watson had returned with troubling news. "The telegraph line's been cut," he reported. "Somewhere between here and Cedar Creek. Henderson might have gotten through, or he might not. No way to know. And even if he did," Martha Palmer added, "it'll take days for help to arrive." "Can we hold out that long against Garrison and his men?" "The mission," Jake said decisively. Jane was right. It's our best defensive position. We need to move, tonight, before the curfew takes effect. "You want us to run?" Big Tom Muller asked, though without accusation. "Leave our homes?" "I want you to live." Jake replied, "Garrison isn't here to arrest anyone. He's here to kill until the town submits. First me and Sarah, then anyone who supported us." The debate was interrupted by Tommy running in from the back room. "Mama, there's a man in the garden. He's hiding behind the tool shed." Jake was moving before the boy finished speaking, drawing his gun as he slipped out the back door. But instead of a threat, he found a surprising ally, Josiah Henderson, dusty and exhausted, his suit torn and bloodied. "Mr. Morrison." Henderson gasped. "Thank God. They were waiting. At Cedar Creek. I barely escaped." They got him inside, Jane immediately tending to a bullet graze on his arm. Henderson's story came out in pieces. Blackwood's men had anticipated his move. Set an ambush. He'd gotten the telegraph off, but couldn't wait for a response. On the ride back, he'd discovered something crucial. "Blackwood's planning something bigger," he said, wincing as Jane cleaned his wound. "I overheard 2 of his men at Cedar Creek. He's got a wagon coming tonight, rifles, ammunition, enough to arm every manhunter in the territory. He's not just trying to kill you 2. He's planning to turn Coyote Ridge into his personal kingdom, rule it like a warlord until he can buy off whatever federal investigators come." "How many guns?" Jake asked grimly. 50 rifles, 1,000 rounds of ammunition. From what I heard, enough to start a small war." Sarah felt the hope that had sustained her begin to crumble. Against a few men, they might have had a chance. Against an army, "We can't let that wagon reach town." Jake said, "If Blackwood arms every gunslinger and desperado he can hire, this becomes a massacre." "You're talking about attacking armed men," Watson pointed out. "That's exactly what Blackwood wants. Actual rebellion he can point to. Sometimes the law and justice part ways." Jake replied, "When they do, a man has to choose which one he follows." Plans formed quickly. The wagon would have to pass through Shepherd's Canyon, a narrow defile 5 miles from town, a perfect spot for an ambush. Jake would lead a small group to intercept it, while the others evacuated to the mission with the women and children. "I'm coming with you," Sarah announced. "Sarah, no, I can shoot," she interrupted. "Daniel taught me, and this is my fight as much as yours." They argued, but Sarah stood firm. In the end, Jake recognized the same determination that had kept her fighting Blackwood for 2 years. She'd earned the right to fight for her freedom. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, 2 groups prepared to leave Jane's house. The larger group, mostly women, children, and older men, would head for the mission under Watson's protection. The smaller group, Jake, Sarah, Big Tom Muller, and 2 younger men who'd volunteered, would ride for Shepherd's Canyon. Tommy clung to his mother, tears streaming down his face. "Don't go, Mama, please don't go!" Sarah knelt, pulling him close. "Sometimes, baby, we have to do hard things to protect what we love. Mrs. Jane will take good care of you, and I'll be back before you know it." "You promise?" Sarah's throat closed up. How could she promise something so uncertain, but looking into her son's trusting eyes, she found the words. "I promise to do everything I can to come back to you. And Jake will help protect me." Jake knelt beside them. "That's a promise from both of us. Partner. We'll look after each other." Tommy threw his arms around Jake's neck, surprising the stoic cowboy. "You better. You're the hero." As they prepared to ride out, Jane pulled Jake aside. "You've changed," she said softly. "The brother who left after the war wouldn't have done any of this." "Maybe I'm remembering who I was before the war," Jake replied. "Or maybe I'm finally becoming who I should have been all along." Jane hugged him fiercely. "You come back too, you hear? Both of you." The 2 groups parted as shadows lengthened across Coyote Ridge. From the courthouse, Wade Garrison watched through field glasses, noting their departure with interest. He made no move to stop them. Not yet. Let them think they were clever. The wagon was well guarded. And if Morrison wanted to ride into a trap, so much the better. But Garrison hadn't counted on the determination of people fighting for their lives and freedom. As Jake's group rode toward Shepherd's Canyon, Sarah beside him in the gathering dusk, they carried more than guns. They carried the hopes of a town that had remembered its courage, the desperation of people with everything to lose, and the growing bond between a widow and a drifter who'd both found something worth fighting for. The confrontation at Shepherd's Canyon would determine more than the fate of a wagon full of guns. It would decide whether Coyote Ridge would fall under the iron rule of a tyrant, or whether ordinary people could stand against injustice and win. As they rode into the darkening desert, Jake glanced at Sarah's profile against the dying light. She sat her horse with surprising grace, rifle across her saddle, jaw set with determination. He'd stood in front of a whip for her yesterday morning. Tonight, she rode beside him into danger. Whatever happened at the canyon, they would face it together, behind them. Coyote Ridge prepared for a night of violence. Garrison's men patrolled the streets, enforcing the curfew with brutal efficiency. Judge Blackwood sat in his courthouse, confident that his reign of terror would soon be absolute. And somewhere in the desert, a wagon loaded with death rolled steadily toward its destination, unaware that hope and courage waited in the shadows of Shepherd's Canyon. The stars began to emerge in the vast western sky, silent witnesses to the drama unfolding below. In a few hours, blood would flow, lives would change, and the fate of a town would hang in the balance. But for now, there was only the rhythm of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth and the shared determination of people who'd chosen to stand rather than kneel. Sarah reached across the space between their horses, briefly touching Jake's hand. No words were needed. They rode on into the night, toward whatever destiny awaited in the narrow confines of Shepherd's Canyon, where justice and law would meet in a clash of gunfire and conviction. Shepherd's Canyon lay silent under a blanket of stars, its narrow walls rising like dark sentinels against the night sky. Jake positioned his small group carefully among the rocks above the canyon floor, each person finding cover with a clear line of sight to the road below. The waiting was the hardest part, minutes stretching like hours, every sound magnified in the desert stillness. Sarah crouched beside Jake behind a large boulder, her rifle steady in her hands despite the tremor in her heart. The moon hadn't risen yet, leaving them in darkness that was both blessing and curse. "You ever been in a gunfight before?" Jake whispered. "No," she admitted. "But I've been fighting Blackwood for 2 years. This is just a different kind of battle?" Jake was about to respond when Big Tom raised his hand, the signal in the distance. They could hear it. The creak of wagon wheels, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of men's voices. The weapon shipment was coming. As the wagon rolled into view, Jake counted the guards. 8 men, all armed, riding in a loose formation around a heavy freight wagon. More than they'd hoped, fewer than they'd feared. The driver looked nervous, constantly scanning the canyon walls. The guards seemed more relaxed, passing a bottle between them, confident in their numbers. Jake waited until the wagon was fully in the canyon. No room to turn around, limited room to maneuver. Then he stood, rifle aimed at the lead guard. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "We don't want bloodshed, but we can't let those weapons reach town." The guards reacted instantly, hands going to guns. But Jake had chosen his ground well. His people had the high ground and cover. The guards were exposed on the canyon floor. "Morrison," the lead guard spat. "Should have known you'd try something stupid. You're outnumbered, outgunned. Ride off now, and maybe we let you live." "Can't do that," Jake replied calmly. "Those rifles are meant to enslave a town. I've seen enough slavery for one lifetime. Then you'll die for nothing." The guard went for his gun. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Jake's first shot took the lead guard from his saddle. Sarah, surprising herself with her steadiness, put a bullet through the shoulder of another guard, sending him spinning to the ground. Big Tom's shotgun boomed like thunder, scattering the horses. But the guards were professionals. They dove for cover, returning fire that sent chips of rock flying around the defenders. The wagon driver tried to whip his team forward, only to pull up short when one of Jake's men put a warning shot in front of the lead horses. In the chaos of the firefight, Sarah noticed the movement on the opposite canyon wall. "Jake," she called out, "they've got men up top too." More guards, held in reserve, began firing down at them from the other side of the canyon. They were caught in a crossfire now, their advantage evaporating. "Fall back to the secondary position," Jake ordered. But as they began to move, Big Tom cried out, clutching his leg where a bullet had found its mark. Without thinking, Sarah broke cover, rushing to help the big blacksmith. Bullets whined past her head like angry hornets, but she reached Tom, helping him limp toward better cover. "Crazy woman," Tom gasped. "You'll get yourself killed." "Not today," Sarah replied fiercely, half dragging him to safety. The battle raged on, muzzle flashes lighting the canyon like deadly fireflies. Jake had lost track of Sarah in the confusion, fear for her safety warring with the need to keep fighting. Then he saw her, crouched behind a rock formation, calmly reloading her rifle with hands that barely shook. One of the guards made a desperate rush for the wagon, trying to reach the rifles stored there. Jake tracked him, fired, missed, fired again. The man stumbled but kept going. If he reached those weapons... Sarah saw it too, standing partially exposed. She took careful aim and fired. The guard pitched forward, falling just feet from the wagon's tailgate. "Nice shot," Jake called out, pride mixing with terror for her. But their ammunition was running low, and the guards still had them pinned. Worse, Jake could hear horses approaching from the direction of town. "Reinforcements." "We can't hold," one of his men said, panic creeping into his voice. "We've got to run." "No," Jake said firmly. "We run now. They'll hunt us down in the open. Our only chance is to—" He was cut off by a new sound, war cries echoing off the canyon walls. Suddenly, riders appeared at both ends of the canyon. Not Blackwood's men, but Apache warriors, painted for battle, moving like ghosts in the darkness. The guards, caught completely off guard, turned their fire on this new threat. But the Apache had the advantage of surprise and superior knowledge of the terrain. In minutes, the surviving guards were fleeing in panic, abandoning the wagon, concerned only with saving their own lives. The lead Apache rider approached Jake's position, and in the starlight, Jake recognized him. Joseph Crowfeather, a man he'd traded with years ago, before the war. "Jake Morrison," Crowfeather said in accented English. "We heard shooting. Thought you might need help." "Joseph," Jake breathed, hardly believing their luck. "What are you doing here?" "Judge in town makes trouble for everyone," the Apache replied. "Takes our water rights. Kills our people who come to trade. Enemy of my enemy." He shrugged eloquently. Sarah emerged from cover. Supporting Big Tom. Crowfeather's eyes widened slightly at the sight of a white woman fighting alongside the men, but he nodded respectfully. The wagon, he asked Jake. Rifles meant to arm Blackwood's private army. Jake explained. We can't let them reach town. Crowfeather smiled grimly. Then they won't. He gave rapid orders in Apache, and several warriors began unloading the wagon, preparing to cache the weapons where they'd never be found. This will bring the army down on your people. Jake warned. Army already comes. Crowfeather replied, better to die fighting for freedom than starve on reservation. Besides, he looked at Sarah. We know something about standing against injustice. As his men worked, Crowfeather shared disturbing news. Many riders in town tonight. Your judge brings fighters from everywhere. Tomorrow, maybe next day. He moves against mission. You cannot go back to town. Sarah's heart sank. Tommy was at the mission. We have to warn them. My people watch, Crowfeather assured her. If soldiers move toward mission, we signal, but you need safe place now. He told them of a hidden canyon further north, where his band was camped. They would be welcome there, could rest and plan their next move. As they prepared to leave, Jake gripped Crowfeather's hand. Why help us? This isn't your fight. When men like Blackwood win, everyone suffers. The Apache replied, My grandfather told me, evil grows when good people do nothing. Tonight, we do something. They rode through the remainder of the night, Big Tom strapped to his horse, grimacing with each step but refusing to complain. Sarah rode close to Jake, the bond between them strengthened by shared danger. I shot a man, she said quietly, the reality of it hitting her as adrenaline faded. To save others, Jake reminded her. To protect your son's future, there's no shame in that. I know, she replied. It's just, I never thought I'd be capable of it. But when I saw him going for those rifles, all I could think about was Tommy, about all the children in town who'd suffer if Blackwood wins. They reached the Apache camp as dawn painted the eastern sky pale pink. It was well hidden, a natural fortress of rock and scrub brush. The women and children of Crowfeather's band watched them arrive with curious but not unfriendly eyes. As Sarah dismounted, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. She'd been running on fear and determination for days. Jake caught her as she swayed, his arms strong and steady around her. Rest now, he murmured. You've more than earned it. They were given a shelter, buffalo robes to rest on, as Sarah tended to Big Tom's wound with supplies from the Apache medicine woman. Jake and Crowfeather planned their next move. Your friend with spectacles, Crowfeather said, meaning Henderson. He reached telegraph. My scouts saw, help comes, but maybe not in time. How long before Blackwood moves on the mission? Tomorrow night, maybe night after. He waits for all his fighters first. Many men. Jake, maybe 40, 50 guns. So, against those odds, the people at the mission, mostly women, children, and old men, wouldn't stand a chance. But returning to town now would be suicide. Sarah joined them, having overheard, We can't abandon them. My son is there. We won't, Jake promised. But we need a plan better than riding in and getting shot. As they talked, debating options that all seemed hopeless, a new voice interrupted. One of Crowfeather's scouts had returned with unexpected news. Soldiers coming, he reported. From Fort Laramie. Many soldiers, riding hard. Hope flared in Sarah's chest. Had Henderson's message gotten through? Were these the federal troops come to restore real law? But Crowfeather looked grim. What flag? Flag of Judge's friend, Colonel Bradshaw. They come to help Judge, not fight him. Jake cursed softly. Bradshaw was notorious. A corrupt officer who sold army supplies to the highest bidder and looked the other way when influential men broke the law. If he was coming to support Blackwood. How long? Jake asked. Tomorrow, sunset maybe. They looked at each other. The math terrible and simple. By tomorrow night, Blackwood would have 50 gunmen plus a cavalry troop. The mission would fall, and with it any hope of justice in Coyote Ridge. Sarah stood slowly, decision crystallizing. Then we don't wait. We go now. Today. Get word to the mission. Evacuate everyone before Blackwood's ready. It's suicide, Big Tom protested from his bedroll. You'll be caught in the open. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged. But my son is there. I won't let him face Blackwood's killers without his mother. Jake studied her face. Seeing the resolution there, the frightened widow he'd first seen in the town square was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her strength in the crucible of conflict. She's right, he said finally. We've been reacting to Blackwood's moves. Time to make one of our own. Crowfeather nodded slowly. My warriors will help. We strike Blackwood's men in town, draw them off, give you time to reach mission. It was desperate, probably doomed. But it was action instead of waiting. As they prepared for what might be their last ride, Sarah found a moment alone with Jake. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. If we don't make it, we'll make it. Jake interrupted. I've got too much to live for now to let Blackwood win. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw in his gaze what he couldn't yet put into words. She rose on her toes, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of desert dust and desperate hope. When they parted, Jake touched her face gently. Let's go get your boy. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, two groups prepared to ride. Crowfeather's warriors would strike at Blackwood's gunmen in town, creating chaos and confusion. Jake, Sarah, and their small band would use that distraction to reach the mission, warn the refugees, and somehow get them to safety before the walls closed in. It was a slim chance, but it was all they had. As they mounted up, Sarah looked back at the Apache camp, at these unexpected allies who'd chosen to stand with them against tyranny. The West was a hard land, but it bred hard people. People who understood that freedom was worth any risk. The last battle for Coyote Ridge was about to begin, and Sarah Mae Collins rode toward it with her head high, a borrowed Apache rifle across her saddle, and her heart full of fierce determination. Beside her rode Jake Morrison, no longer the drifting loner, but a man who'd found something worth fighting for. Behind them rode the shadows of all who'd stood against injustice before, Apache warriors, freed slaves, common folk who'd refused to bow to tyrants. And ahead waited either death or deliverance. But either way, they would meet it standing tall under the vast western sky. The sun hung high and merciless as Jake's group approached the outskirts of Coyote Ridge. In the distance, they could already hear the sounds of Crowfeather's diversion gunshots, shouting, the thunder of horses' hooves. Smoke rose from the western edge of town where the Apache warriors had struck at Blackwood's supply depot. They're giving us the opening we need, Jake said, scanning the terrain with field glasses. Most of Garrison's men are heading toward the fight. Sarah's heart raced as she spotted the old Spanish mission on the rise north of town. Its adobe walls glowed golden in the afternoon light, looking deceptively peaceful. But Jake's glasses revealed the truth-armed men patrolling the perimeter, keeping watch on the refugees inside. Blackwood's already got men there, Jake muttered. Not many, maybe 6 or 7, but enough to keep everyone penned in. Then we fight, Sarah said firmly. They approached using the dry riverbed that wound below the mission, keeping out of sight until the last possible moment, when they were close enough to hear voices from the walls. Jake held up his hand for halt. Sarah, you and Tom's nephew circle east. When you hear shooting, come in from that side. The rest of us will hit them from the front. Draw their fire. Sarah wanted to protest being separated from him, but understood the tactics. She nodded, checking her rifle one last time before moving off with young Will Muller. The attack, when it came, was swift and decisive. Jake and his 2 men charged from the riverbed, guns blazing. The guards, caught between watching the chaos in town and their prisoners, reacted slowly. 2 went down in the first volley. From the east, Sarah and Will added their fire, catching the remaining guards in a crossfire. It was over in minutes, the surviving guards throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Mama! Tommy's voice rang out from inside the mission as the gate swung open. He flew into Sarah's arms, and she held him tight, tears streaming down her face. My brave boy, she whispered. I'm here. I'm here. Jane Morrison emerged with the other refugees, her face showing relief and fear in equal measure. "Thank God you made it. We heard the fighting in town, didn't know what was happening. Crow Feather's people are buying us time," Jake explained quickly. "But it won't last. Garrison will regroup, and when he does, he'll come here in force. We need to move everyone now." Watson, who'd organized the refugees into family groups, shook his head. "Move where? We've got elderly, children, wounded. They can't outrun cavalry." Jake was about to respond when Henderson appeared, still pale from his wound but mobile. "I might have a solution. There's an old mine about 3 miles northeast, abandoned but defensible, if we can reach it. The Silver Bell." Martha Palmer said, "My late husband worked there before it played out. It's got water, deep shafts for shelter. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than remaining at the mission." They organized quickly, loading the wounded and elderly onto the few wagons they had, everyone else preparing to walk or ride. As they prepared to leave, one of Crow Feather's warriors appeared, riding hard. He spoke rapidly in Apache to Jake, who'd learned enough of the language to understand. "Soldiers closer than expected." Jake translated. "And Garrison's regrouping. We've got maybe an hour before they come this way." The evacuation became a controlled panic. Families grabbed what they could carry, mothers hushing crying children, old men helping each other along despite their own frailty. Sarah kept Tommy close while helping organize the exodus, her eyes constantly finding Jake as he coordinated their defense. They were halfway to the mine when disaster struck. Dust clouds on the southern horizon announced approaching riders, too many to be anything but Garrison's force or the cavalry. "Keep moving," Jake shouted. "Don't stop." He gathered their few fighters, maybe a dozen men and women willing to make a stand. Sarah started to join them, but Jake caught her arm. "No, Tommy needs you. Get to the mine. Help fortify it. Jake, please, Sarah. I can't fight if I'm worried about you both." She saw the plea in his eyes and nodded, though it tore at her to leave him. "You come back to us," she said fiercely. "You hear me, Jake Morrison? You come back." He kissed her quickly, then turned to face the approaching threat with his small band of defenders. The running fight that followed would be remembered in the annals of Coyote Ridge as the Freedom Run. Jake's defenders used every trick, false retreats, ambush positions, anything to slow the pursuit and give the refugees time. They made Garrison's men pay for every yard, turning the 3-mile journey into a bloody gauntlet. Sarah reached the mine entrance with the last of the refugees, immediately organizing defenses. The Silver Bell had been well chosen. Its entrance was narrow, approachable only through a defile that would funnel attackers. The women loaded rifles. The older children gathered rocks for throwing. Everyone who could hold a weapon prepared to make their stand. From the mine entrance, Sarah could see the running battle approaching. Her heart leaped as she spotted Jake, still mounted, still fighting. But they were being pressed hard, and several defenders had fallen. "Get ready," Watson called out. "They're coming." The defenders reached the mine entrance just ahead of their pursuers. Jake's horse was lathered with sweat and blood. Not all of it, the animals. He swung down, pushing Sarah and Tommy deeper into the mine. "How many?" Watson asked. "Too many," Jake replied grimly. "But they'll have to come at us through that narrow approach. We can hold, for a while." The first attack came within minutes. Garrison himself led it, his hired guns charging the mine entrance with the confidence of superior numbers. They met a wall of lead from the defenders, the narrow approach becoming a killing ground. But ammunition was limited, and Garrison had men to spare. After the first assault was repelled, he settled in for a siege, knowing time was on his side. Inside the mine, Henderson worked frantically with the telegraph equipment he'd salvaged from the mission. "If I can just get a signal out, let the real federal authorities know what's happening." Night fell, bringing a blessed respite. The defenders took stock ammunition running low, several wounded, but morale still holding. Sarah found Jake standing watch at the entrance, staring out at the enemy campfires dotting the darkness. "Regrets?" she asked softly. He turned to her, pulling her close. Only that I didn't stand up sooner, that I waited so long to find something worth fighting for. They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other. Around them, the refugees huddled in the mine shafts, families clinging together, children sleeping fitfully, everyone waiting for dawn and whatever it would bring. "Riders coming!" The lookout's whisper sent everyone to alert. But instead of another attack, a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. Crowfeather, with a dozen warriors, had fought through Garrison's lines. "Cannot stay," the Apache leader said quickly. "But brought these." His men carried ammunition boxes, not much, but enough to make a difference. And message, real federal marshals 2 days away. Henderson's signal heard. Hope flickered in the darkness. 2 days. They just had to hold for 2 days. "My people keep fighting," Crowfeather continued. "Hit them, fade away, make them watch all directions." He gripped Jake's shoulder. "You stand with honor. Jake Morrison, we remember." Then they were gone, melting back into the darkness like smoke. Dawn brought renewed attacks. Garrison, frustrated by the night's harassments and aware that time might not be on his side after all, threw everything at the mine entrance. The defenders fought with desperate courage, making every shot count. During a lull, Judge Blackwood himself appeared, standing just out of rifle range with a white flag. "Mrs. Collins," he called out, "let's end this foolishness. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee safe passage for the women and children. Continue this resistance, and I'll see every last one of you hang." Sarah appeared at the entrance. Tommy held back by Jane despite his protests. "The only one who'll hang is you, Blackwood, for corruption, murder, and tyranny." "Huh, you stupid woman," Blackwood raged. "I offered you mercy once. I won't offer it again." "I don't want your mercy," Sarah called back. "I want justice. And it's coming for you. Judge, federal marshals, honest ones, are on their way. Your friend Colonel Bradshaw won't save you from them." Blackwood's face went purple, but before he could respond, gunfire erupted from the east. Crowfeather's warriors had struck again, this time at the cavalry's horse lines. In the confusion, Blackwood retreated to safety. The siege continued through the day, each attack beaten back but at increasing cost. Jake took a bullet in the shoulder, Sarah bandaging it with torn petticoats while he kept firing. Big Tom, despite his leg wound, propped himself at a firing port and proved deadly with his buffalo rifle. As the sun began to set on the second day, ammunition nearly exhausted, Jake gathered the defenders. "They'll come hard tonight," he said. "Try to finish us before help arrives." "We need—" He was interrupted by a new sound, a bugle call, but not from Garrison's direction. From the east, a dust cloud resolved into mounted troops, the flag at their head bearing federal insignia. "It's too early," Watson said suspiciously. "Could be Bradshaw trying to trick us." But as the troops deployed, surrounding Garrison's forces, their leader rode forward under a flag of truce, a real federal marshal, badge gleaming, accompanied by a full company of cavalry from Fort Douglas, a fort known for its honest commander. The tables had turned in an instant. Garrison's men, caught between the mine's defenders and federal troops, threw down their weapons. Judge Blackwood, trying to bluster his way out, was arrested on the spot when Henderson emerged with his carefully preserved evidence. As the federal troops secured the scene, Jake and Sarah stood at the mine entrance, Tommy between them, watching justice finally come to Coyote Ridge. Her land would be safe now. The town would be free of Blackwood's corruption. The price had been high. Good people lost, blood shed, but freedom always came with a cost. "What now?" Sarah asked, suddenly uncertain. The fight that had brought them together was over. Jake looked down at her, then at Tommy, who was clinging to both of them. "Now we build something better. Together, if you'll have me." Sarah's answer was in her kiss, there in front of everyone. Propriety be damned. They'd faced death together, fought for justice together. The rest would be easy by comparison. As the stars appeared overhead, the refugees emerged from the mine. Battered, exhausted, but victorious. Crowfeather's people appeared from the shadows, no longer enemies to be feared, but allies to be honored. And in the federal marshal's tent, Judge Blackwood sat in chains, his empire of fear reduced to rust and dust. The quiet cowboy had stepped in front of a whip meant for an innocent woman, and in doing so had changed the course of many lives. It was, Sarah thought as she held her son and leaned against Jake's solid presence, exactly the kind of legend the West would remember, not of outlaws and violence, but of ordinary people standing against injustice and winning through courage, determination, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the fire of shared struggle. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a sea of sand and scrub brush beneath a sky that seemed to press down with physical weight. They'd been riding for 2 days since leaving Coyote Ridge, putting distance between themselves and any remnants of Blackwood's influence who might seek revenge. Federal marshals had assured them the town was secure, but Jake had lived too long on the frontier to trust completely in law's protection. Sarah rode beside him, Tommy drowsing in front of her on the saddle. The boy had handled their flight with remarkable resilience, treating it as an adventure rather than the desperate escape it truly was. Behind them rode Jane Morrison and a handful of others who'd chosen exile over remaining in a town filled with bitter memories. "Water," Jake said, pointing to a line of cottonwoods in the distance that marked a stream. "We'll rest there through the worst of the heat." As they made camp in the shade of the trees, Sarah noticed Jake favoring his wounded shoulder. The federal doctor had treated it, but riding hard across rough country had prevented proper healing. "Let me look at that," she said, approaching with medical supplies from her saddlebags. "It's fine," Jake protested, but she was already unbuttoning his shirt. "Men," she muttered, "you'd ride until your arm fell off rather than admit you need help." As she cleaned and redressed the wound, her fingers gentle despite her scolding tone. Jake studied her face. The sun had bronzed her skin, and the hardships of the trail had sharpened her features, but she'd never looked more beautiful to him. "Where are we going, Jake?" she asked softly. "We can't run forever." He'd been wrestling with the same question. They had enough money from the sale of Sarah's land. The federal authorities had ensured she got fair value to start over anywhere. But where could they go that the past wouldn't follow? "California," Jane said, joining them. "I've been thinking about it. Gold rush is over, but there's good farmland in the valleys, places where people are too busy building their own futures to care about anyone's past." Tommy had wandered to the stream, throwing pebbles into the water. Sarah watched him, her heart aching at how quickly he'd had to grow up. He needs stability, a real home, school, friends who won't whisper about his mother, the outlaw. "You're not an outlaw," Jake said firmly. "You're a woman who stood against injustice. Nothing shameful in that." That night, as they camped under stars that seemed close enough to touch, danger found them again. Jake, ever alert even in rest, heard them first, horses approaching slow and careful, trying to mask their sound. He touched Sarah's shoulder, waking her instantly. She'd learned to come alert without sound, reaching for her rifle in one smooth motion. Around them, the others stirred, the frontier instincts that had kept them alive this far serving them still. The riders emerged from the darkness, 5 men, hard-faced and travel-worn, bounty hunters. Jake recognized the type immediately. Word of Blackwood's fall would have traveled, but some would still try to collect on the judge's final warrants. "Jake Morrison," the lead rider called out. "Sarah Collins, you're wanted for sedition, murder, and inciting rebellion. Come peaceful, and nobody else needs to get hurt." "Those warrants were issued by a corrupt judge who's now in federal custody," Jake replied calmly, though his hand rested on his pistol. "They're not worth the paper they're printed on." "Paper says $500 each," the bounty hunter countered. "That's worth plenty to us." Sarah stepped forward, rifle cradled in her arms. "There are women and children here. You'd shoot through them for blood money?" The bounty hunter shifted uncomfortably. It was one thing to track dangerous criminals, another to gun down families, but greed won over conscience. "Everyone else stands aside. No one gets hurt but the ones we came for," the leader said. No. Jane Morrison stood. Then Big Tom, despite his injured leg. Then the others. They formed a line between the bounty hunters and their targets. You want them. You go through all of us. The moment stretched taut. Violence balanced on a knife's edge. Then Tommy broke free from Jane's grasp, running to stand in front of his mother and Jake. You leave them alone, he shouted, small fists clenched. They're heroes. You're the bad men. Something in the child's fierce defiance must have touched even those hardened hearts. The lead bounty hunter looked at his men, saw their uncertainty, and made a calculation. Not worth it, he muttered. Not for maybe money from a jailed judge. Let's ride. They vanished into the darkness as quickly as they'd come, but the encounter left everyone shaken. How many more would come? How far would they have to run? The next morning brought a new challenge. The desert, which had seemed merely harsh before, turned vicious. A sandstorm rose from nowhere, forcing them to huddle together, bandanas over faces, eyes squeezed shut against the stinging grit. Sarah pulled Tommy against her, shielding him with her body. Jake pressed close, using his larger frame to protect them both. For hours they endured, the world reduced to howling wind and scouring sand. When it finally passed, they were half buried, their water supplies contaminated with grit. Jake surveyed their situation grimly. They were still a day from the next water source, and the storm had driven them off course. We push on, he decided. No choice. The day that followed tested them to their limits. The sun beat down mercilessly on the storm-scoured landscape. Water ran low, then out. Tommy stopped complaining, which worried Sarah more than tears would have. The elderly struggled, supported by the younger, everyone sharing what little they had. By late afternoon, with the sun a molten ball on the horizon, some began to falter. Sarah's lips were cracked, her throat parched, but she kept moving, kept encouraging others. This was what the frontier demanded, not just courage in moments of violence, but endurance through the long, grinding hardships. There, Jake croaked, pointing ahead. Green. Impossibly, beautifully green. The oasis wasn't large, a spring-fed pool surrounded by palms and grass, but it was salvation. They stumbled the last distance, some falling to their knees at the water's edge. Slowly, Jake warned. Drink slowly or you'll make yourself sick. As they recovered in the shade of the palms, Sarah found herself watching Jake organize their camp, tend to the animals, check on each person in their group. He'd changed so much from the silent drifter who'd ridden into Coyote Ridge, or perhaps he'd simply remembered who he'd always been beneath the war's scars. That evening, with everyone fed and watered, spirits began to recover. Someone produced a harmonica, and soon, quiet music drifted across the oasis. Tommy played with the other children, their laughter a healing sound after the day's trials. Sarah found Jake standing apart, watching the desert with the vigilance that never fully left him. No one's coming, she said softly. Not tonight. You can rest. Old habits, he replied, but let her lead him back to the fire. They sat together, not touching but aware of each other with every breath. Around them, their makeshift family settled for the night. These people who'd stood together against tyranny, who'd chosen loyalty over safety, who'd walked through hell side by side. I've been thinking, Sarah said quietly. About California, about starting over. It scares me. Jake, what if we can't build something new? What if the past follows us? Jake turned to her, his gray eyes serious in the firelight. Then we face it together, just like we've faced everything else. He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. Sarah, I need to say something. Should have said it days ago. She waited, heart hammering. I love you, he said simply. Not just for your courage or your strength, though Lord knows you've got both in spades. I love the way you hum when you're cooking, the way you bite your lip when you're thinking, the way you'd face down an army for Tommy. He took a breath. I'm not good with words, never have been, but I want you to know, wherever we go, whatever we face, I want to face it with you. If you'll have me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. but they were tears of joy. "Jake Morrison, are you proposing to me in the middle of the desert, covered in trail dust, without a ring or preacher in sight?" A rare smile crossed his weathered face. "Reckon I am, though we can do it proper when we reach civilization, if you prefer." She kissed him then, not caring who saw, tasting alkali dust and dreams of the future. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes to all of it. To California, to whatever comes, to building a life together." Tommy, who'd been pretending to sleep nearby, couldn't contain himself. "Does this mean Jake's going to be my papa?" The adults laughed, the sound bright against the vast darkness of the desert. Jake held out his arm, and Tommy scrambled over, fitting himself between them. "If that's all right with you, partner," Jake said seriously. Tommy's answer was to throw his arms around both of them, and Sarah felt her heart might burst from fullness. They stayed at the oasis for 2 days, recovering strength and spirits. On the second night, Jane performed a simple ceremony by the pool, with the stars as witness and their fellow travelers as congregation. It wasn't legal, perhaps, but it was real, 2 souls pledging themselves to each other and to the family they'd already become. Big Tom gave the bride away, his eyes suspiciously wet. Martha Palmer sang a hymn in her cracked soprano. Even the children contributed, weaving flower crowns from the hardy blooms that grew near the spring. "Do you, Jake Morrison, take this woman to be your wife, to stand beside her through drought and plenty, through peace and peril, for all the days of your life?" "I do," Jake said, his voice strong and certain. "Do you, Sarah Mae Collins, take this man to be your husband, to stand beside him through trial and triumph, through wandering and homecoming, for all the days of your life?" "I do," Sarah whispered, then louder, "I do." They kissed as the group cheered, and if the desert had ever seen a happier moment, it kept its secrets. The next morning they resumed their journey, but everything had changed. They were no longer refugees fleeing injustice, but pioneers heading toward a new life. The desert still challenged them. Water scarce, heat overwhelming, distances vast, but they faced it differently now. Sarah rode beside her husband, her son chattering happily about the ranch they'd have in California, the horses Jake would train, the garden she'd plant. It was a child's dream, bright and perfect, but no less real for its innocence. "Look," Tommy pointed ahead. "Mountains." In the distance, the first peaks of the coastal range rose blue and promising. Beyond them lay California, lay the future, lay a life they'd build with their own hands and hearts. Jake reached over, taking Sarah's hand. His wedding ring, crafted from a horseshoe nail by Big Tom, caught the light. It wasn't gold, wasn't fancy, but it was honest metal shaped by a friend's hands, and that made it perfect. "No regrets?" he asked. Sarah squeezed his fingers. "Only that it took so long to find you." They rode on through the desert, through the harsh beauty of the American frontier, carrying with them the lessons of Coyote Ridge, that ordinary people could stand against injustice, that courage could bloom in unexpected places, that love could grow even in the rockiest soil. Behind them, the past faded like their tracks in the shifting sand. Ahead, California waited with its promises and challenges. But for now, in this moment suspended between what was and what would be, they had each other, and that was enough. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and possibility, and 3 hearts, bound by choice and chance and courage, beat as one toward whatever destiny awaited them in the green valleys beyond the mountains. The first light of dawn painted the coastal mountains in shades of rose and gold as their weary band crested the final ridge. Below them, California's Sacramento Valley spread like a promised land, green with winter rains, dotted with oak groves and ribboned with streams that actually held water year-round. "Lord have mercy," Big Tom breathed, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "It's like Eden after the desert." Sarah felt Jake's arm tighten around her waist as they sat their horse, Tommy secure between them. After weeks of sand and scorching heat, the sight of such abundance made her eyes water. though perhaps it wasn't just the landscape that moved her. There, Jake pointed to a small settlement in the middle distance. Harmony Creek. Jane's cousin wrote that they're welcoming to newcomers, long as they're willing to work. The descent into the valley took most of the day, their pace slow to accommodate those on foot. But spirits were high. Martha Palmer started a traveling song, and soon everyone joined in, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. Even Jake, who Sarah had never heard sing, added his rough baritone to the chorus. Harmony Creek proved to be everything promised and more. The town was young, built by those who'd come for gold but stayed for the land. There was no judgment in the eyes that greeted them, only curiosity and the measured welcome of people who understood that everyone in California came from somewhere else, usually with reasons for leaving. The mayor, a German immigrant named Otto Bernhardt, pumped Jake's hand enthusiastically. Farmers, ranchers, craftsmen, we need them all. You'll find no questions about the past here, only interest in what you can build for the future. Within a week, they'd found their place. 40 acres of good bottomland with a creek running through it, a small cabin that could be expanded, and neighbors who offered help without prying into their history. The previous owner had gone back east, defeated by the isolation, but Sarah saw only possibility. It needs work, Jake said, surveying the overgrown fields and sagging fences. Everything worth having does, Sarah replied, already envisioning vegetable gardens, fruit trees, a proper house with a wraparound porch. They were married again, properly this time, in Harmony Creek's white-clapboard church. Jane stood as Sarah's matron of honor, while Big Tom, his leg finally healed, served as Jake's best man. Tommy carried the ring's real gold bands this time, bought with the first money Jake earned breaking horses for local ranchers. The whole town turned out for the wedding, bringing food, gifts, and genuine goodwill. As Sarah danced with her husband in the church hall, she marveled at how different this felt from Coyote Ridge. There, she'd been the suspect widow. Here, she was simply Mrs. Morrison, wife of that skilled horseman, mother of that bright boy who was already top of his class in the new school. Spring brought planting season and back-breaking work. Jake proved to have a gift with horses that spread his reputation throughout the county. Sarah's vegetable garden flourished, and she began selling produce in town, her preserves and pickles becoming particularly sought after. Tommy thrived, growing brown and strong, losing the pinched look that constant fear had given him. He followed Jake everywhere, learning to gentle horses, mend fences, read the weather. At night, he did his schoolwork by lamplight, determined to be educated like Mr. Henderson. They'd received one letter from the prosecutor, telling them that Judge Blackwood had been convicted on multiple counts of corruption and conspiracy, sentenced to 20 years hard labor. Sheriff Garrison had fled to Mexico. Coyote Ridge was rebuilding under new, honest leadership. The past, it seemed, was finally past. Summer brought unexpected visitors. A dust cloud on the road resolved into familiar figures, Crowfeather and several of his warriors, driving a small herd of horses. Jake Morrison, the Apache leader, greeted him with rare warmth. "We bring wedding gift. Delayed by troubles, these horses carry the blood of the wind. Breed them well." They stayed for 3 days, and Sarah was struck by how easily they fit into Harmony Creek's accepting embrace. Tommy spent every moment with the Apache children, learning their games and words. When they left, Crowfeather clasped Jake's hand. "You have found your place," he said simply. "The land knows when someone belongs to it." Fall arrived with abundant harvest. Sarah's pantry filled with preserved foods, the root cellar with vegetables. Jake's horse training had brought in enough money to expand the cabin. Adding proper bedrooms and a larger kitchen, they worked side by side, building their dreams board by board, nail by nail. One evening, as they sat on their new porch watching Tommy play with the puppy Jake had brought home, Sarah felt a flutter in her belly that had nothing to do with dinner. "Jake," she said quietly, "we're going to need another bedroom come spring." He turned to her, eyes widening with hope and wonder. "You mean?" She nodded, laughing at his expression. Tommy's going to be a big brother." Jake pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She felt him tremble and realized he was crying. This strong, quiet man who'd faced down armies without flinching, undone by the promise of new life. Winter came gentle to the valley, nothing like the brutal cold of the high desert. They spent long evenings by the fire, Jake carving toys for the coming baby, while Sarah sewed tiny clothes. Tommy practiced reading aloud from his school books, proud to show off his learning. Jane visited often, having settled in town as a seamstress. She was being courted by the schoolmaster, a kind widower named James Hartley, and Sarah delighted in teasing her sister-in-law about her blushes. "Never thought I'd see the day," Jake said one evening, watching Jane and James walk out together. Both Morrison siblings, settled and happy. Ma would have been proud. As Sarah's time grew near, the women of Harmony Creek rallied around her, the same way frontier women always had. When the pain started on a storm-lashed March night, Martha Palmer was there within minutes, along with the town midwife and Jane. Jake paced the kitchen like a caged wolf while Tommy tried to distract him with chess moves. Hours passed, punctuated by Sarah's cries and the encouraging voices of the women. Then, as dawn broke clear after the storm, a new cry joined the symphony. Strong, indignant, alive. "You have a daughter, Mr. Morrison?" Martha announced, beaming. "Healthy as a horse and twice as loud." Jake stumbled into the bedroom, finding Sarah exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of her quilts. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and, when she opened them, gray eyes like her father's. "Meet Hope Elizabeth Morrison," Sarah whispered. "Hope for the future, Elizabeth for your mother." Jake touched his daughter's perfect fingers with one rough fingertip, wonder written across his face. "She's beautiful, perfect, like her mama." Tommy crept in, eyes wide. "She's so small. Was I ever that small?" "Even smaller," Sarah assured him. "But you grew strong, and so will she. You'll be the best big brother, won't you?" "I'll teach her everything," Tommy promised solemnly. "How to ride and read and be brave like you and Papa Jake." As the sun climbed higher, flooding their bedroom with golden light, Sarah looked around at her family, complete now, whole in ways she'd never dared dream during those dark days in Coyote Ridge. Jake sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her, the other cradling their daughter. Tommy leaned against them both, already protective of his sister. Through the window, she could see their fields ready for spring planting, the horses grazing in the pasture, the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. They'd traveled so far from that dusty town square where a quiet cowboy had stepped in front of a whip meant for her back. That moment of courage had changed everything, setting in motion a chain of events that led them here, to this valley, this life, this love. "No regrets?" Jake asked, echoing his question from the desert. Sarah smiled, pressing a kiss to Hope's downy head before meeting her husband's eyes. "Only gratitude, for second chances, for the courage to take them, and for finding home in each other." Outside, Harmony Creek stirred to life, its citizens beginning another day of building dreams in the California sun. The Morrison family, forged in the crucible of injustice and tempered by trials, had found their place at last. The quiet cowboy and the brave widow had written their own legend, not of gunfights and glory, but of standing for what was right, of love blooming in unlikely soil, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when courage called. As baby Hope yawned and settled into sleep, safe in her parents' arms while her brother kept watch, the morning sun blessed them all with its warmth. They were home, they were family, they were free, and in that freedom, bought with courage and paid for in hope, they would build a life worthy of the prices they'd paid to find it. The West had tested them, broken them, and ultimately reformed them into something stronger. Now, in this green valley so far from where their story began, they would write the remaining chapters with their own hands, their own choices, their own love. The legend of the quiet cowboy who stopped a public whipping would fade into frontier folklore, told around campfires and in saloons. But the truth of it, the love that grew from that moment of moral courage, would live on in the generations that followed, in the children and grandchildren who would hear the tale and understand that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when one person says no to injustice and another finds the strength to stand beside them. In Harmony Creek, California, as the morning sun climbed toward noon, the Morrison family began another day of their hard-won happily ever after. Proof that even in the Wild West, love could conquer all. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope you enjoyed following Sarah and Jake's journey from that fateful moment in Coyote Ridge to their new life in California. Where are you listening to this story from? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to know where in the world our tales of the Old West are reaching. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of courage, romance, and adventure from America's frontier days. What did you think of Sarah and Jake's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one and love hearing from you all.